Engines thundered across the gray ceiling of Europe on the morning of March 12, 1944.
At 26,000 feet, a U.S. Army Air Force's B-17G Flying Fortress clawed west to east over the North Sea, its four Wright Cyclone engines droning in imperfect unison.
Frost filmed the windows. Oxygen masks hissed. Below, cloud layers hid the continent that had already learned the sound of American bombers. The aircraft belonged to the 8th Air Force, part of a daylight offensive meant to break Germany's war industry by force, altitude, and repetition. Inside the fuselage, the crew moved with practiced economy. The pilot kept his eyes level with the artificial horizon, gloved hands steady on the yoke. The co-pilot ran fuel checks.
The navigator hunched over charts marked with pencil lines and grease smudges. Waist gunners checked feed trays for the .50 caliber Brownings, their steel jackets cold to the touch. In the nose, the bombardier adjusted the Norden sight, aligning gyros while the wind screamed past plexiglass. No one spoke more than necessary.
Conversation wasted oxygen and attention. Formation lights blinked through the murk as other fortresses slid into position. Dozens became hundreds, boxes stacking at altitude, silver wings knitting into a moving city. Somewhere ahead lay occupied France, then the Reich. The route was planned to the minute. Turn points. Bomb release lines. Emergency fields marked in red ink, far apart and unreliable. If something failed over enemy territory, survival depended on discipline and luck, in that order. Flak was expected. Fighters were expected. Damage was expected.
The briefing had been blunt.
Target resistance would be heavy. Weather unpredictable. Return uncertain.
Each man had signed his name beside his serial number and folded the thought away. Fear did not vanish, it narrowed. The mission demanded focus, not courage speeches. As the formation crossed the coast, sunlight broke through in hard shards, igniting aluminum skins.
Tracers arced far below from coastal batteries, harmless for now, reminders written in orange.
The intercom crackled with terse confirmations.
Altitude steady. Airspeed steady. Engines within limits.
The bomber pressed on, indifferent to the men inside who knew that routine could shatter without warning. Ahead, the cloud cover thinned. Beyond it waited black bursts, tightening spirals of steel, and decisions no checklist could soften. Somewhere between the engine's roar and the cold bite of altitude, the mission tipped toward a moment that would test whether a pilot could bring a crippled aircraft home when the rules ran out. Below the formation, rivers glinted like blades, and rail yards waited, stitched to schedules and smoke. Somewhere, mechanics would listen for returning engines at dusk. Somewhere else, searchlights were being tested, guns elevated, fighters warmed. The pilot tightened his harness and checked the trim again. The fortress held its line, steady and exposed. In minutes, the sky ahead would turn hostile, and one small failure would begin a chain no one could stop. Nothing in the briefing had prepared them for what came next. The clock was already ticking.
Now.
The aircraft was a B-17G Flying Fortress, serial numbers stenciled in dull black along the tail, its olive drab skin scarred by previous missions. Built to absorb punishment, it carried 10 men, 13.50 caliber machine guns, and the expectation that it would be hit and keep flying. The fuselage smelled of oil, cold metal, and sweat trapped inside heavy wool and leather.
Every rivet mattered.
Every cable hummed with tension as the bomber held formation. At the controls sat a first lieutenant barely into his 20s, shoulders hunched beneath a shearling-collared jacket. His boots rested on the rudder pedals, feet numb from altitude. He had trained in Texas skies, learned to land on long concrete runways with instructors watching. Now he flew with flak charts memorized and the knowledge that one mistake would kill everyone behind him. Beside him, the co-pilot tracked engine temperatures, eyes flicking between gauges and the gray horizon.
Neither man spoke unless it mattered. Behind them, the navigator worked in near darkness, red light washing over maps creased from use. Pencil marks traced routes that ignored borders and lives below.
The radio operator monitored the set, headphones pressed tight, listening for commands buried in static.
Silence often meant trouble.
The ball turret gunner lay curled into steel and glass, knees tight to chest, rotating beneath the aircraft like a hanging watchful eye. His world was narrow, loud, and lethal. The waist gunners stood on either side of the fuselage, tethered by harnesses, scanning for fighters that might slash through the formation. Their gloves were stiff with cold, fingers wrapped around charging handles. The tail gunner crouched at the rear, isolated, staring into the empty space where attacks came without warning. Every man wore a flak vest. Every man carried a sidearm he would likely never use. They were clerks, farmhands, mechanics, students before the war. Now they were specialists bound together by altitude and fate. Rank mattered less than trust. The pilot trusted the engineer to manage power. The engineer trusted the gunners to keep fighters away. The crew trusted the aircraft to hold when steel tore through aluminum. None of them believed in luck. They believed in procedure. As the bomber droned eastward, vibrations traveled through the frame, a constant reminder that the engines were working harder than advertised. The crew checked and rechecked, hands moving by habit. Below, Europe waited, indifferent. Above, contrails marked paths of men doing the same job, risking the same end. The flying fortress was designed to come home damaged. That promise had limits. Every mission tested them. Every mission narrowed the margin. As the aircraft crossed deeper into hostile airspace, the men settled into their roles, unaware that the machine meant to protect them would soon demand a price none of them had trained to pay. When the first burst of flak climbed toward the formation, the crew braced, not knowing that the aircraft itself was about to become their greatest challenge. The first flak burst bloomed ahead of the formation like a dirty black flower, sharp-edged and sudden. It was followed by another. Then dozens. German 88mm guns had found the range. The sky turned violent, bursting and cracking, steel fragments tearing through air that seconds before had felt empty. The bomber shuddered as concussions slapped its wings. The sound was not an explosion but a brutal tearing, as if the sky itself were ripping apart. Inside the B-17, the noise was overwhelming. Shrapnel hammered the fuselage, rattling ribs and snapping cables. The aircraft lurched left, then corrected. Warning lights flickered. The engineer shouted engine readings over the intercom, voice clipped and tight. The pilot held the yoke firm, jaw locked, eyes tracking the artificial horizon while the world outside disintegrated into smoke and black bursts. A shell detonated close off the port wing. The shockwave punched through aluminum skin. Metal screamed. The left engine coughed, sputtered, then caught again, vibrating harder than before. Oil pressure dipped. The co-pilot reached instinctively for the throttles as the engineer called out numbers that no longer sounded reassuring. Another burst cracked above the cockpit, showering fragments that tore antenna wiring loose. The formation was breaking apart. Bombers drifted out of alignment, some trailing smoke, others bleeding fuel that atomized into white mist. A fortress ahead took a direct hit. Its nose disappeared in a flash, the aircraft snapping backward before rolling away, men and metal scattering into the void. No parachutes bloomed. The intercom went silent for a second too long as the crew absorbed what they had seen. More flak climbed toward them, timed and deliberate. A burst exploded beneath the belly. The aircraft jumped violently. The ball turret rocked. The gunner inside shouted that his rotation had jammed. The pilot fought the controls as the bomber dipped, then clawed back to altitude. The left wing vibrated with a new, uneven rhythm. Something was wrong, badly wrong. Smoke crept along the fuselage, thin but unmistakable. The engineer traced it to the port engine. Oil sprayed across the cowling, streaking back in long black lines. The propeller began to windmill, losing bite. The pilot ordered the engine feathered. The procedure was automatic, drilled into muscle memory, but the aircraft responded sluggishly, nose yawing as power bled away. Another explosion rocked the cockpit. A fragment tore through the forward section, shredding control lines and vanishing somewhere behind them. The controls went soft, then heavy. The pilot tested the yoke. It moved, but not cleanly. The co-pilot met his eyes for the first time since the flak began. Neither spoke. The bomber was still flying, but its margin was gone. Below them, the flak batteries kept firing, methodical and patient. Above, the formation pulled away, forced to maintain speed in altitude.
The fortress was falling behind, wounded and exposed.
As the smoke thickened and the engine coughed again, the crew realized the damage was worse than they could see. Something essential had been taken from the aircraft, and the sky was not finished collecting its due.
The pilot leveled the bomber and ordered a damage check.
At 25,000 feet, assessment meant shouting through masks and crawling through freezing air. The engineer moved first, unclipping and edging along the narrow catwalk toward the bomb bay, boots slipping on oil-slick metal. He reported ruptured lines, torn skin, and a port engine barely holding power. The co-pilot logged numbers while the pilot trimmed constantly, fighting a stubborn yaw that refused to settle. The navigator checked drift and distance.
They were deep over enemy territory, past the last marked emergency strip.
Turning back meant crossing the same gun belts again. Pressing on meant trusting a wounded machine. The radio operator called the group frequency.
Static answered.
The formation was gone, pulled forward by schedule and altitude. Falling behind was dangerous.
Being alone was worse.
Aft, the tail gunner reported sluggish controls. The cables felt heavy, delayed. The waist gunners confirmed holes along the fuselage, daylight showing where rivets should have been. One gun was jammed by fragments. The ball turret finally freed itself, but the gunner's voice shook.
He had taken a hit through the housing. Blood was controlled. Pain was ignored. Smoke thickened, acrid and persistent. The engineer traced it again. Oil starvation was worsening. He recommended shutting the port engine down completely to prevent fire. The pilot agreed.
Feathering finished the job, and the bomber lurched as asymmetric thrust vanished.
Airspeed bled. Altitude slipped.
The pilot traded height for control, nose dipping just enough to keep the wings alive.
Then came the check no one wanted. Landing gear status. The co-pilot ran the panel, cycling indicators. No green lights. He tried again. Nothing. Hydraulic pressure was low. Lines had been severed by flak.
The manual pump was engaged.
The handle fought back, stiff and useless. Minutes passed.
The indicators stayed dark.
They ran procedures again, slower.
The engineer inspected what he could see through access panels. Fluid sprayed and froze instantly, feathering the air with ice crystals.
The system was dead. The gear would not come down. Not here. Not later. Not anywhere. Silence settled, broken only by engines and breathing. The pilot recalculated. A gear-up landing was survivable.
On concrete, with room.
If they made it home.
If fighters did not finish them first. If the airframe held together. The navigator marked a long return, skirting known flak belts, aiming for a friendly field with lengthened fire crews. The crew acknowledged without ceremony.
Belts tightened. Loose gear stowed. Every man understood the new stakes. The bomber was no longer just damaged.
It was committed to a landing that would test steel, discipline, and nerve. As they turned west, smoke trailing and speed fragile, the pilot knew the hardest part was still ahead, waiting at the runway. Ahead, the airfield was a promise and a threat, its concrete unseen, its lights uncertain, and every mile between them and home magnified by fuel loss, enemy fighters, and the knowledge that there would be no second attempt today.
The cockpit became a workshop of math and restraint.
With one engine shut down and the landing gear lost, every decision narrowed to numbers: airspeed, weight, fuel burn, distance. The pilot held a shallow descent, guarding the wings from a stall while keeping speed above the red line for control. The co-pilot recalculated landing weight, dumping fuel in measured bursts to reduce fire risk and impact force.
Vapor streamed behind them, white against the dark sky, a signature that invited pursuit. Charts came out.
The navigator selected a long concrete field used by the 8th Air Force, aligned into the prevailing wind, ringed with crash crews.
Runway length mattered more than comfort.
A belly landing would grind aluminum, not rubber, and friction would decide whether the bomber stopped or cartwheeled. The pilot adjusted trim to keep the nose light. The engineer balanced remaining engines, coaxing smooth power without overheating. The aircraft flew wounded, obedient only within a narrow envelope. Fighter threat calculations followed. Alone, slow, and trailing smoke, the bomber was vulnerable. The waist gunners scanned constantly, eyes watering from cold and strain.
Ammunition was conserved for a single, decisive defense.
The tail gunner reported clear skies, then cloud fingers, then clear again. The pilot chose altitude bands that complicated interception, trading height for cloud cover, trusting weather to do what guns could not. Inside the cockpit, hands moved without drama.
Switches were checked, rechecked, then left alone. The co-pilot rehearsed the landing profile in silence, power settings, flare attitude, engine cutoff timing. The pilot pictured the runway threshold, the moment of contact, the long slide, the risk of fire. He planned for evacuation lanes and ordered loose gear secured. Oxygen masks stayed on. No one relaxed. Weather reports filtered in, imperfect and late. Cloud tops promised concealment but hid icing risk. The pilot waited anyway, choosing a path that bent away from known gun belts and patrol lanes. The co-pilot set emergency checklists aside and focused on feel, listening to engines through vibration rather than needles. The engineer rigged fire bottles and breathed suppression steps. In back, the crew tightened harnesses and cleared fields of fire. Every calculation now served one purpose: reaching concrete alive. Time compressed as daylight thinned, margins shrank, and resolve hardened across the cockpit floor. Below, fields and rivers passed in muted gray. Ahead lay friendly airspace and the most precise flying of the mission. The aircraft would have one chance to meet the ground on its own terms. As the pilot reduced power slightly and tested control response, he knew the calculations were finished. What remained would be execution under fire's shadow, with no wheels, no backup, and no room for error. The bomber limped westward, wounded and slow, crossing enemy territory with the stubborn momentum of damaged machinery and human will. One engine was silent, its propeller feathered like a broken wing. The remaining engines labored unevenly, each vibration traveling through the frame and into bone.
Smoke no longer poured, but the smell of burned oil lingered, heavy and constant. The pilot kept the nose carefully balanced, riding a narrow band of airspeed that kept the wings alive without tearing them loose.
Below them, the land sharpened into detail.
Fields scarred by craters. Rail lines threading toward cities wrapped in smoke. Rivers cutting dark lines through pale ground. Every mile forward reduced fuel, increased risk, and narrowed options. The navigator called bearings in short bursts, voice steady, correcting drift caused by asymmetric thrust. The co-pilot adjusted power by touch, not numbers, easing strain from engines already pushed beyond comfort. Enemy fighters were expected. None appeared. The crew did not relax.
Silence could be camouflage or a prelude. The waist gunners scanned relentlessly, sweeping arcs through cold air that numbed fingers and stiffened joints.
The tail gunner watched empty sky with the patience of someone who knew attacks came when vigilance failed.
Ammunition remained untouched, saved for a moment that might last seconds.
The engineer moved again through the fuselage, checking for heat and new leaks. He pressed a gloved hand against warped skin, feeling vibration patterns change with each adjustment.
Temporary fixes held. Control cables still responded, though sluggishly. The bomb bay doors remained closed, their mechanisms spared by chance. The crew's survival depended on small mercies accumulating faster than failures. Clouds gathered ahead, thick and uneven. The pilot dipped into them deliberately, trading visibility for concealment. Ice formed along leading edges, roughening airflow. De-icing boots pulsed, shedding crusts that broke away and vanished. The aircraft shuddered but stayed controllable. Inside the cloud, the world reduced to instruments and breathing. Outside, guns and eyes searched for what they could no longer see. Fuel gauges slid toward lower marks. The co-pilot recalculated again, then stopped. The numbers no longer changed the plan. They would make landfall with little reserve. There would be no go-around. The pilot briefed the crew over intercom, concise and final. Harnesses tight. Fire bottles ready. Egress paths memorized. The words were procedural, stripped of comfort. Breaking free of the clouds, the bomber crossed the coastline. Friendly airspace did not feel safe yet.
The aircraft remained damaged, heavy, and committed to a landing it could not abort. Radio contact crackled, thin but reassuring, guiding them toward the chosen field. The pilot lowered altitude in shallow steps, testing response after each change, keeping the wounded fortress stitched together with trim and restraint.
As land rolled beneath them, the aircraft held, improbably intact.
But the hardest miles remained ahead, measured not in distance but in seconds at the runway threshold.
With the field now ahead and daylight fading, the crew felt the weight of every choice converge into one final approach they could not practice, delay, or escape. The return stretched longer than any map could show. With fuel gauges hovering near empty, the bombers settled into a careful cruise that favored endurance over speed. Every adjustment cost something. More power meant less range. Less power risked losing lift. The pilot chose restraint, hands light on the controls, eyes moving between the horizon and instruments that now mattered more than scenery. The engines answered unevenly, a tired rhythm that set the pace for everything else. Silence filled the aircraft in layers. The radio was quiet except for brief course corrections from ground stations, each transmission thin and fragile. Intercom chatter faded to essentials. No one wasted breath. Fear did not announce itself. It crept in through the gaps between engine pulses, through the awareness that there was no fuel to fight surprise, no altitude to trade, no second choice waiting. The crew felt it without naming it. The navigator recalculated drift again, then stopped when the answer stayed the same. Wind pushed them slightly north. Correcting would cost fuel they could not spare. The pilot accepted the drift and adjusted the approach plan in his head. The co-pilot monitored temperatures, coaxing engines through a narrow comfort zone. Oil pressure wavered. The engineer leaned close to the gauges, ready to act if one more needle fell. Below, the countryside softened as evening approached. Smoke columns thinned. Shadows stretched. The war felt distant for a moment, replaced by fields, roads, and rivers that looked almost peaceful from altitude. That calm was deceptive. The bomber remained vulnerable, its wounds hidden beneath steady flight. Any failure now would be final. The crew understood this without discussion. The gunners stayed alert, though exhaustion crept into posture and grip. Eyes burned from cold and strain. Fingers ached inside gloves. No fighters appeared. The absence pressed harder than contact. Silence suggested either safety or preparation. The tail gunner called out cloud edges, then clear sky, then cloud again. The pilot nodded and held course. Fuel warnings flickered. The co-pilot shut off non-essential systems. Heat reduced. Lights dimmed. The aircraft grew colder, quieter. The pilot briefed the landing sequence again, a steady cadence meant to anchor everyone to procedure. Wheels would not come down. Flaps would be limited. Touchdown speed would be higher than normal. Evacuation would be immediate. No one asked questions. As the airfield finally came into range, it did not bring relief. It sharpened focus. The pilot aligned with the approach path, testing controls with small inputs. Response remained sluggish but predictable. The engineer armed fire bottles. The crew tightened harnesses. The runway lay ahead, a long gray strip that represented both survival and impact. Fuel gauges slipped toward zero. The pilot resisted the urge to hurry. Rushing would cost control. He held altitude a moment longer, then began the descent. The aircraft responded, heavy and reluctant. The silence deepened, broken only by engines and breathing. With the field now filling the windscreen and fuel nearly gone, the bomber committed to its final approach, carrying every mile of the return into a single, unforgiving line toward the ground. The airfield filled the windscreen, long and narrow, bordered by dark grass and waiting vehicles. Crash crews stood clear of the runway, engines idling, men watching the wounded bomber's descent. The pilot aligned carefully, correcting drift with measured pressure, keeping the nose steady and the wings level. There would be no flare like a normal landing. Too high and the aircraft would drop hard. Too low and it would strike early and tumble.
Inside the cockpit, the co-pilot called airspeed in short, precise bursts. The needle hovered above the minimum, just enough to maintain control.
Flaps came down in stages, limited by damage and fear of asymmetric lift. The aircraft settled, heavy and reluctant.
The pilot adjusted trim again, then locked it. From here on, touch would matter more than theory. The engineer moved through the fuselage one last time, checking for heat, sniffing for fuel. He armed fire bottles and reported clear. The radio operator secured loose equipment and switched off remaining power where ordered.
In back, the gunners stowed weapons and braced.
The ball turret was locked.
The tail gunner sealed his position and tightened his harness, eyes forward, waiting for impact.
The pilot briefed evacuation one final time, voice even.
Cut engines at contact. No brakes. Keep straight. Exit fast. Stay upwind.
The words were familiar, practiced, stripped of hope or fear.
They were instructions for survival, nothing more.
As the bomber crossed the threshold, the pilot reduced power incrementally. The engines answered, then coughed, fuel nearly gone. He held the nose just above the horizon, resisting the instinct to pull back.
Speed bled away.
The runway rushed beneath them, concrete texture sharpening, seams flashing by.
The aircraft sank. Engines were cut.
Silence slammed into the cockpit, broken only by wind and the hiss of airframe drag. The pilot held the yoke steady, muscles locked. The co-pilot watched the far end of the runway disappear, calculating distance without numbers.
There would be no correction now.
The belly met concrete with a scream of tearing metal.
Sparks erupted along the fuselage, white and violent.
The aircraft shuddered but stayed straight, sliding on aluminum and steel.
Friction pulled hard, trying to yaw them sideways.
The pilot fought it with rudder and prayer, keeping the nose aligned as speed collapsed. Smoke poured in through seams.
Heat climbed.
The aircraft slowed, grinding forward, shedding skin and parts.
At last, it stopped, a long scar etched into the runway behind it.
The pilot shouted the order.
Harnesses released. Hatches opened.
Men moved fast, boots hitting concrete, spreading away from the aircraft as fire crews surged forward. Behind them, the fortress sat low and broken, alive with ticking metal and drifting smoke. The crew had survived the approach, but the danger had not finished with them yet.
Flames licked closer, and the aircraft that had carried them home began to give up its final fight. The aircraft had stopped, but danger had not.
The fortress settled into a low, wounded stillness, metal ticking as it cooled, smoke seeping from seams torn open by the slide.
Fire crews advanced cautiously, hoses charged, boots splashing through foam and spilled fuel.
The crew scattered upwind, coughing through masks, eyes fixed on the bomber as if it might move again.
Inside, the damage revealed itself in brutal clarity. The belly was ground flat, frames shaved away, antennas gone.
Propeller blades were bent and scarred, frozen where engines had been cut. Hydraulic fluid and oil streaked the concrete in long black lines. The nose sagged, plexiglass crazed but intact, the cockpit spared by inches and discipline. The wings held, astonishingly, their spars absorbing the punishment that would have snapped lesser machines.
Medics reached the crew first. Hands checked helmets, counted heads, pressed fingers to wrists. Cuts were dressed, burns cooled, shock measured by the steadiness of voices.
The ball turret gunner was helped clear, knees trembling after hours curled in steel. The engineer limped, refusing a stretcher until every man was accounted for. The pilot stood last, helmet still on, eyes scanning the aircraft and the runway beyond, replaying the slide in silence.
Fire crews attacked the hotspots.
White foam smothered sparks.
Steam rose and drifted. The threat receded, but it did not vanish. Ammunition remained aboard, and every creak of cooling metal carried the promise of a delayed catastrophe.
Orders kept the perimeter clear. The crew watched from a safe distance, bound by habit to their machine, unwilling to turn away until it was fully quiet.
Ground officers arrived, notebooks open, questions short. How fast? Which engine first? Where the sparks began?
The pilot answered evenly, facts without flourish.
The co-pilot added numbers.
The navigator pointed to the scar carved into the runway, tracing the final path with his boot. Mechanics circled the fortress, hands on hips, shaking heads at what had held and what had failed. One pointed to the belly and laughed once, a sharp sound of disbelief.
Night crept in.
Lights came on, harsh and white, revealing shredded aluminum and blackened streaks. The aircraft looked older now, exhausted, its war finished in a long scrape of concrete. The crew shed gear piece by piece, setting helmets down, loosening collars, the cold finally reaching skin.
Fatigue hit in waves. Hands shook. Knees softened. The adrenaline that had carried them across a continent drained away. Someone counted again. All 10 were there. No deaths. No missing. The words felt unreal. The pilot removed his helmet and breathed deeply, the smell of smoke replaced by grass and oil and night air. The fortress had brought them home without wheels, without certainty, on skill and restraint alone. It had asked everything and given one last service in return. Behind the cordon, the aircraft rested, quiet at last. The runway bore its mark, a scar that would be scrubbed clean by morning. The crew would sleep, then answer more questions, then fly again or not. For now, survival stood between them and the dark. The war continued elsewhere, but on this strip of concrete, the moment belonged to the men who had met the ground and lived to walk away. By morning, the runway was cleared and the fortress was cordoned off, its scarred belly resting on blocks, evidence catalogued in chalk and photographs. Mechanics traced shrapnel paths with practiced fingers, counting rivets lost, measuring frames bent but unbroken. The assessment was clinical, unemotional. What mattered was that the airframe had held long enough. In a war measured by sorties and tonnage, this machine had delivered something rarer, time. The crew moved through debriefs under hard lights. Questions came in clean lines: altitude, headings, engine failure sequence, hydraulic loss, touchdown speed. Answers were precise, stripped of drama. The pilot emphasized restraint. The engineer described balance. The navigator marked the route that bent away from flak and patrols. No one claimed heroism. They described work done correctly under pressure, because that was the language the 8th Air Force understood. Word traveled anyway. A gearless landing without fatalities spread through squadrons faster than orders. It reached maintenance tents and mess lines, then other fields, then other groups. Crews paused over coffee and cigarettes, absorbing the lesson without instruction. Discipline mattered. Trim mattered. Patience mattered. A fortress could be brought home if the rules were followed and fear kept quiet. The aircraft itself became a classroom. Young pilots stood beneath the wing, staring at scraped aluminum and scorched paint, listening as ground chiefs explained where the structure had saved lives. Engineers pointed to the belly, to the spark carry-throughs that had absorbed the slide. Gunners traced where sparks had traveled and stopped. The lesson was not invincibility. It was margin, earned and preserved. Official recognition followed in time. Citations referenced judgment, crew coordination, and adherence to procedure. Names were typed, ranks listed, dates fixed. Paper caught up with reality. The crew dispersed back into the machinery of war, some to new aircraft, some to hospitals, some to desks stacked with flight plans. The pilot flew again after checks and rest, carrying the memory quietly, not as pride but as obligation to repeat what worked. Outside the airfields, the war rolled on. Bombers lifted at dawn, contrails stitched the sky, flak answered as before. Losses continued. Victories accumulated slowly. Yet the story endured because it compressed the conflict into a single truth: survival was not accidental. It was engineered by training, reinforced by restraint, and delivered by hands that refused to rush the final moments. Years later, photographs remained, grainy images of a bomber resting low on concrete, men standing small beside it, smoke thinning into daylight. The runway was repaired. The field returned to routine. But the landing entered memory as a proof point, cited when margins narrowed and confidence wavered. It reminded crews that the aircraft could give one last chance if given the chance to do so. History did not crown the moment with fanfare. It recorded it and moved on. That was enough. The legacy lived where it mattered, in cockpits where pilots trimmed instead of yanked,
in engineers who balanced instead of chased needles, in crews who trusted procedure when instinct urged haste. The fortress had come home without wheels and without drama, carried by calculation and restraint.
In the silence after impact, it left a mark deeper than the scar on the runway, a standard that would be tested again, whenever the ground rose fast and there was no second attempt.